11 American presidents, and 11 things the country wasn't supposed to find out. A president who hid a disease that was killing him while he still ran the country. A president who let hundreds of newspapers call him a murderer and never once denied it. A cover-up performed on a yacht in international waters, so no reporter could prove it happened. The office has always come with a portrait and a monument. It has not always come with the truth. Some of these stories took decades to surface. One of them took a Supreme Court order. We're starting in 1830, with the president who signed one law and unleashed a death march that killed thousands. Andrew Jackson ran for president as a man of the people, a war hero who'd fought his way up from nothing. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people off land they had lived on for generations. The march west became known as the Trail of Tears. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee alone died along the way, from cold, disease, and starvation, walked at gunpoint by soldiers enforcing a law Jackson had pushed through Congress himself. The Supreme Court had already ruled the removals unconstitutional. Jackson ignored the ruling and enforced the policy anyway, reportedly telling associates that Chief Justice John Marshall could enforce his own decision if he wanted to. Jackson's face is still on the $20 bill. James Buchanan inherited a country splitting in two, and for 4 years he did almost nothing to stop it. As Southern states began seceding in the final months of his term, Buchanan declared secession illegal and then declared he had no constitutional power to stop it either, a position that satisfied no one and left his successor a war already half-started. He is the only president never to marry, and Washington gossip of the era paired him for decades with William Rufus King, a senator he lived with for years and called his wife in private letters that survive today. Buchanan's family destroyed most of his personal correspondence with King after his death. Historians still argue over what exactly they were hiding. What isn't argued is the outcome. Buchanan left office in March of 1861. The Civil War began 5 weeks later. Andrew Johnson took office after Lincoln's assassination and spent his presidency fighting to undo everything Lincoln had died for. He vetoed civil rights protections for freed slaves, pardoned former Confederate leaders by the thousands, and handed formerly enslaved people back into economic dependence on the same plantation owners who had once owned them. When Johnson tried to fire his Secretary of War without Senate approval, Congress impeached him. The vote in the Senate came down to a single ballot. Johnson survived his trial by exactly 1 vote and finished his term as a president who had been formally charged with abusing the office he still held. He remains, to this day, one of only 3 American presidents ever impeached. Ulysses S. Grant won the Civil War and then presided over one of the most corrupt administrations in American history. His own vice president took bribes from a railroad construction company in the Crédit Mobilier scandal. His personal secretary was indicted for running the whiskey ring, a scheme that siphoned millions in liquor tax revenue into the pockets of distillers and government officials alike. Grant himself was never proven to have taken $1, but he shielded the men around him again and again, testifying in defense of his own secretary and refusing to believe the evidence in front of him. By the end of his presidency, cabinet members had resigned in disgrace. Congressmen had been indicted, and the word Grantism had entered the language as shorthand for government theft. Grant died broke, writing his memoirs against a clock set by throat cancer, just to leave his family something to live on. Chester Arthur became president after James Garfield was assassinated, and almost immediately, he learned something he decided the country didn't need to know. Doctors diagnosed him with Bright's disease, a fatal kidney condition, within a year of taking office. Arthur told almost no one. He spent his presidency in visible physical decline, while reporters speculated and the White House denied everything, at one point releasing a statement calling him the picture of health. He quietly stopped seeking a second term, not because he lost the nomination fight, but because he knew what his own doctors had already told him. Arthur died a little over a year after leaving office. The disease that killed him had been public information for exactly 0 of the days he spent running the country. During his first campaign in 1884, Newspapers discovered Grover Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock with a woman named Maria Halpin, a scandal that produced the campaign chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" Cleveland won anyway, reportedly telling his aides to simply tell the truth about it. 9 years later, in his second term, doctors found a tumor in his mouth. Terrified that any hint of presidential illness would trigger a financial panic already brewing in the country, Cleveland had the tumor removed in total secrecy aboard a private yacht in Long Island Sound, disguised as a fishing trip. Surgeons operated inside his mouth so no visible scar would show. The surgery worked. The cover story held for 24 years, until one of the surgeons finally told the truth in 1917 after Cleveland was already dead. Warren Harding filled his cabinet with friends from Ohio, who came to be known as the Ohio Gang, and several of them turned the federal government into a business. His Interior Secretary secretly leased Navy petroleum reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private oil companies in exchange for personal bribes, a scandal that eventually sent a sitting cabinet member to prison for the first time in American history. Harding himself was carrying on a long affair with a woman named Nan Britton, who later published a book claiming she'd given birth to his daughter and that they'd had sex inside a White House closet. In August 1923, on a return trip from Alaska, Harding collapsed and died suddenly in a San Francisco hotel room. His wife refused an autopsy. Rumors of poisoning followed him into the history books, unproven and unresolved, because the one thing that could have settled it was the one thing nobody was allowed to check. Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down after contracting polio in 1921, and for the entirety of his unprecedented 4 terms in office, his administration worked to make sure the American public never fully understood how disabled their president actually was. The Secret Service intercepted photographers who tried to capture him in his wheelchair. Newsreel cameramen followed an unspoken rule never to film him being carried or wheeled anywhere. In April 1945, Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, while sitting for a portrait. The woman in the room with him wasn't his wife. It was Lucy Mercer, the same woman whose affair with Roosevelt had nearly ended his marriage decades earlier. Eleanor Roosevelt learned both facts, her husband's death and her rival's presence at it, in the same phone call. In August 1964, Lyndon Johnson told Congress and the American public that North Vietnamese boats had launched an unprovoked attack on U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress responded by passing a resolution that gave Johnson sweeping war powers without a formal declaration of war, and American involvement in Vietnam escalated from there. Declassified documents released decades later showed that the second attack, the one Johnson used to justify the resolution, likely never happened at all. A case of misread sonar readings during a storm that Johnson's own administration knew were doubtful within days. Johnson pushed the resolution through anyway. 58,000 American soldiers would eventually die in a war that expanded on the strength of an attack that the government's own records suggest was never real. John F. Kennedy campaigned as the picture of youthful vigor, and almost none of it was true. He suffered from Addison's disease, a life-threatening hormonal disorder, along with chronic back pain so severe he wore a brace and received regular injections just to stand through public appearances. His medical team and campaign staff spent years actively denying reports of his declining health. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, shot while riding in an open motorcade. The Warren Commission concluded a lone gunman was responsible. Multiple later government investigations, contradictory witness accounts, and decades of partially classified files kept the theory of a wider conspiracy alive for 6 decades and counting, making his death the most examined and least settled question in modern American history. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee's offices at the Watergate complex in Washington. Richard Nixon denied any connection to the break-in for 2 years, while secret tape recordings running inside the Oval Office captured him discussing the cover-up in his own voice. When the Supreme Court forced Nixon to release the tapes in 1974, one recording revealed He had ordered the CIA to block the FBI's investigation just days after the burglary, an obstruction of justice caught on his own recording equipment. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, the only American president ever to do so. He was pardoned a month later by his own successor, before a single criminal charge was ever filed against him. 11 presidents, 11 secrets, each one buried by the same tool: the assumption that the public would never find out. A death march the courts had already ruled illegal. A surgery hidden on a yacht. A war justified by an attack that may never have happened. Some of these came out in a matter of months. Others took half a century, a court order, or a deathbed confession from someone who'd been sworn to silence for years. The office comes with enormous power to shape what history records in real time. It has never come with the power to keep it buried forever. If this kept you here until the last frame, you already know why these stories don't stay hidden for good. Subscribe for the next one.